Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Dispatch. We've got some breaking news coming.
Not in my backyard.
See, that's exactly our theme for tonight. The Dispatch is our brand new show here at COASTER-net, where we take some of the news stories over the past few weeks and look at them in a more editorialized way. And tonight's theme is exactly that, as Jeff said, the not in my backyard. Jeff, you've been tracking some of these stories over the last few weeks of local neighborhoods having issues with theme parks and it causing, issues with ride placement, with rides being approved or not. Why don't you take us through a quick little history of what we've seen in the past few months here?
Yeah, I mean, we always kind of think of the parks as our own, so we want to be good neighbors in a sense, but we don't want our neighbors interfering with our fun. And, with our last update, we talked a little bit about how the neighborhood around Magic Mountain might have been part of the reason that West Coast racers in the underground area had issues and, some significant construction delays. There's also been a story out of Kings Island recently, a couple of weeks ago, tracking noise or projected noise complaints for Orion and basically citing their experience from the past that we can talk about. Great Escapes has been going back and forth with local planning boards and their neighbors about their new Adirondack ride, where they're worried about sound and visibility to the different neighbors. So there's a lot of different reasons to be upset with your neighbors, I guess.
Well, and it's the one thing I see a lot is people enthusiasts a lot get angry at these things, and partly they should, partly they shouldn't. But we see enthusiasts get upset, like, oh, why would the neighbors care? The park, was there when they moved in, and that's true to some extent. But you also have to look at it from their perspective too, where they have to actually live there and deal with this stuff every single day. And maybe some of the things that, the park was there when they moved in, and maybe some of these things weren't there when they moved in. Like I can tell you a quick story here. When I used to, like you've heard, I moved over the summer. In my former town, there was a baseball stadium there. And they decided to start doing fireworks shows every single Friday night during the summer or for home games or whatever. Now, when I moved in, it wasn't like that. They decided to do that afterwards. And some people had issues with that. At first I'm like, whatever. But then after every single week and after every single year, it does begin to wear on you. The stress is, especially when you have animals and fireworks going off. That sort of thing, eventually wears on you. And that wasn't something that was there when I first moved in. So when we think of a place like Kings Island, and we see one of the stories here, complaining about Orion and the noise that it's causing, this neighborhood, like you kind of said, that it kind of, you did a little study here, it kind of grew up with the park. Yes, Kings Island was there, but Kings Island didn't have 200, 250 tall foot rides going up in the air that would actually cause problems when these people first moved in, right?
Yeah. So what I saw in like old satellite pictures and aerial photos, because this is the neighborhood basically south of Kings Island, it was mostly farms and in the mid 90s, as the park started getting bigger, it was still like mostly small farmhouses. But then in the 2000s, it started to become like, it looks like HOAs and subdivisions and, like condos and things like that. But they look, nice. People probably moved in expecting that it was a nice, quiet area because they were used to that right away. But then Cedar Fair came in and they installed Diamondback. And that's when they started having issues because everybody knows the spine on those B&M tracks, they create a very different noise than the Superior Intamin tracks. They're much nicer to their neighbors. The box beam, though, is basically like an amplifier, and that roar is something that I actually really like when I'm on the ride, but if I had to live near it, it would be a totally different story. So they petitioned to have sand put in Orion. And the park basically said, hey, message received, but they haven't really indicated if they're going to do that or not.
Well, and we've seen parks put in sand into the B&M tracks and other places, most notably Silver Bullet out at Knott's Berry, because that neighborhood, literally, you have the park and then across a city street there are houses right there. So sometimes they demand that a ride be placed, like we're seeing with Great Escape right now, is sometimes they demand that the ride be moved into an interior part of the park so that there's more space between the ride and the neighborhood. Sometimes they demand that sand be put in. We see that with Silver Bullet, things like Talon that greatly reduce the noise. And what was the other one you said?
Leviathan.
Yeah.
Leviathan, Canada's Wonderland grew up as the neighborhood across the parking lot basically grew up as well. And they actually weren't prepared for those noise complaints. That was like a surprise, I guess, for the park officials. So they had actually done a sound study after the ride was built. They did an engineering study after the ride was built, and they figured out that they could add the sand retroactively. So they didn't need to cut the track where the cars would ride, so it doesn't affect the ride, but they were able to cut open the spline and basically fill it with sand, just the first drop. But that made their neighbors happy. So, it was probably worth the sand.
Well, and that's the balancing act here. Yeah, that as me as a roller coaster enthusiast, as a theme park enthusiast, I want to see the park build the biggest, the best, and I really don't care about the neighborhood. That's my concern. My concern is I want to get the most for the money that I'm spending for my ticket, my pass, et cetera, or whatever. But like I said, if you live there, you have to understand those concerns too, that you can't just say, oh, well, they shouldn't have moved in there. Well, yeah, I could move anywhere and they could build an airport next to my house over here. And then all of a sudden I got airplanes flying over my house, so you really can't predict the future. And I think a lot of times when these people did move in, these weren't legitimate concerns. Now, noise is one thing, but over in the past, we've also seen traffic concerns being a big issue as well. And sometimes these are all things that play into one another. Sometimes it is the noise. Like for me, when I was living by the baseball field, it was the noise. The traffic didn't really bother me. But when we look at places like Jaga Lake that everyone likes to talk about, and SeaWorld, Ohio, which eventually became, the Six Flags Worlds of Adventure, it was the traffic that eventually killed that park, that the local government didn't support anything that the park did because the local people didn't support it because they didn't like to have all that traffic in their neighborhood. I was just reading a story that the local zoo over here, Brookfield Zoo, there was a story in the newspaper last week on how when they're doing their Christmas light show called Zoo Lights, that the people are saying that they feel trapped in their houses because the traffic is so bad, they can't leave any time or they would be stuck in 2 to 3 hour traffic outside of their houses. So this was the concern, and ultimately was one of the reasons why Jaga Lake, I think, closed. That I think the neighborhood tolerated it as SeaWorld, Ohio. They tolerated it as Jaga Lake. And then when it kind of blew up into this big Six Flags thing, that's when they said, nah, this ain't happening. And when Cedar Fair comes in, well, then, everything goes to hell, in a handbasket pretty quickly there. And you can blame whoever you want for that. I'm not playing the blame game with Jaga Lake, but I'm saying that the traffic concerns and those type of concerns were major issues with that park. And we see that in a lot of places too, that the traffic concerns are one of the paramount problems along with noise being this. And Jeff, I just don't know if this is a problem that is going to go away. We're going to see this become more and more of an issue as a lot of these places, get bigger. Things like Kings Island and Knott's and Canada's Wonderland. The only places that don't seem to have these problems, and I really hate to say it, but it's the places like Six Flags America, like Six Flags Over Georgia, because they're built in poorer neighborhoods and they don't have access to the legal resources that you might need to fight some of these things. And maybe that's a different sign of our culture. I don't know what that is. But I think, Six Flags Great America is in an upper middle class area, blue collar, upper middle class. And they fight with the neighborhoods all the time too, that it's a constant, zoning board issue. Sometimes it has to do with height waivers. That sometimes, and the neighborhoods are really smart where there's no law against traffic, that there's nothing you can do. But there are laws against noise, and there are laws against height waivers, or height restrictions. So sometimes the neighborhoods that have the legal know-how will find those loopholes to try to fix problems that they see are coming. And if their problem is traffic or their problem is noise, they're going to find ways through the legal system to get those fixed.
Yeah, and I know, more in my zone, I go to Six Flags New England a lot, and it is a working class kind of neighborhood there, but the neighborhood and the park have a pretty decent relationship, but they've also had their local government flex their muscles on that park before, so they've shown it. I mean, I don't know what your experience was when you traveled there. I know you said you went there more than once, but
yeah,
there's a lot of stores right along that main drag that probably really rake in the dough from people driving in and out of that park. But there's also people that live and work adjacent to the park that create their own parking. I don't know if you've ever noticed that, but like they charge, less than Six Flags parking for people with day tickets. And they, obviously the park just kind of looks the other way and doesn't complain to the town, or the town looks the other way to just kind of keep everybody happy. But that's kind of like the opposite story where you've kind of got the neighborhood and the park having like a weird, symbiotic relationship where they're benefiting each other in a sense.
Well, and that's the trade-off too. Is yeah, they say, the problem is that these parks do generate a whole lot of money in tax dollars and revenue dollars, in people coming in to spend overnight in hotel rooms, frequent in local restaurants. So there is an obvious benefit. You look at like a place like Cedar Point, and Cedar Point doesn't have a whole lot of neighbors besides the Chaussee people, which also was an issue this year. Is many of those very, very rich houses along the lake there, new rules are now in place that don't allow people to drive down that Chaussee anymore. So we'll see how that plays out next year, because once again, traffic issues were the problem. But then, the people in Sandusky have this love-hate relationship with Cedar Point, where they love it when they get to go there, they get the tax dollars, but they hate it when there's the gridlock traffic all up and down, the interstate and up and down the different roads. But they get a whole lot of improvements out of it too. And sometimes it's the city of Sandusky, if you read any of their stories when they comment, it's always like, the stuff that we're able to do in the city is directly from Cedar Point. So when we get to redo roads and repave this, and people of Sandusky will take me up on that. They'll argue, well, they're only paving stuff that benefits Cedar Point and doing it. So there's, like I said, two sides to everything. But the city of Sandusky will say that without this tax revenue and without giving Cedar Point certain benefits and certain, exclusions from taxes or whatever, that then that they wouldn't be able to do what they do in the city for everyone. So it's kind of like this double-edged sword, I think, that I don't know if I would want to live right next to a park, to be completely honest with you. I don't think that's like, it sounds like it'd be really fun to like walk over, I've always said, if I could move to Sandusky, I'd buy one of the houses on the Chaussee. Well, that's because I'm probably not going anywhere, and I'm probably going to go to Cedar Point every day. It might be fun to do that. But to have to live there, and even if I only visited the park like a handful of times and have to deal with that on an everyday basis, I don't know if that's, and granted, you're buying into that at some level. Maybe you do, maybe you didn't, maybe you bought before all that happened. I don't know, but I don't think we're going to see this issue go away. And the classic places that we always see these battlegrounds, Knott's Berry Farm, Busch Gardens, Williamsburg, what are some of the other ones here? Kings Island now. So all of these battlegrounds are going to be there, and I just don't feel like it's going to go away anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I would have an issue with the visual impact, like Busch Gardens and the Queensberry, which is where Great Escapes is. That seems to be the issue with their neighbors, is the visual impact and like basically hiding stuff under the tree lines and stuff like that. I think that part of living near the park would be like a nice thing to me. But I like to sleep, so
I guess it depends. I guess it depends on what the visual impact is, because if I got to sleep next to Windseeker going up 300 feet with all the lighting packages that it has, I don't know if I want, 50 million LED lights shining in my windows at night.
Wow.
So, and that, I also feel like the visual thing is like one of those loopholes that they find that, hey, we don't want this to actually happen. We don't want this park to get bigger, because if it gets bigger, so we're going to use this loophole of visual impact to get around that.
Yeah, and I think that it's really hard for neighborhoods. I mean, like if you moved in someplace, to really predict like what could go in. Like I'm sure that the people in the Charlotte area, that's a big growing area, had no idea that a 300-foot roller coaster was even possible, even though 400-foot roller coasters had even been built, because people just don't know that. And also another thing that's kind of compounding the issue is the trend right now, not only bigger is better, is that bigger calendar and longer hours. So you're seeing parks tacking on lots of days to their season, adding extra weekends, and also in the fall staying open late when it's dark. So that's gonna be another thing that really is a rallying cry for these neighborhoods. Is like, okay, we put up with it in July, we put up with it in August, now we're putting up with it in September, October, it's bleeding into November. I'm hearing Christmas songs in December, like at really loud decibels. And I'm sure if I had to listen to like Jingle Bells every night for 4 or 5 hours, I'd be going jingle insane,
Well, like going back to my opening story of the fireworks, if they did it not only every Friday, but then every night of the week, and then they started doing it in October, and then hosting event, then, like I said, it's that general wearing on what you can tolerate. And that's why I think we see a whole lot of these stories pop up, is that people have said enough's enough, and we want to live our lives the way that we have, and we don't want to, kind of change, because these tax benefits might not, they might not care about the revenue that's generated for the hotel down the block. Like that doesn't affect me. So, ultimately we'll see what happens. Hopefully it doesn't stop us from enjoying the parks that we like to, and stop parks from actually building the stuff that they want to, so hopefully.
Ultimately right now, Orion's being built. I mean, we see that. Obviously, there's no going back on that. And the Adirondack Outlaw, I think is what it's called, they've decided to move it from Ghost Town, which was a higher area, into the front of the park, which is away from that neighborhood. So it's going to be over more near the Steam and Demon. So, they had to make a compromise.
Yeah.
But it's still happening.
So ultimately, we'll see what happens. But thanks for joining us here tonight on The Dispatch. I'm, of course, Andrew Barczyk from Chicago, Illinois.
And I'm Jeff Goodman from Long Island, New York.
Right on, Red Warriors.